We've all probably had that disconcerting situation happen to us, whereby we're confident that we've spent enough time with the source materials, we're pretty sure that we've committed the material to memory, only to get to an examination and realise that our confidence in our knowledge was completely misplaced and we don't know nearly as much as we thought we did. But the question is, why does this happen, and what simple change can you make to your study and practices that will avoid this scenario happening again in the future? There's actually a really simple reason why it's very easy for you to get an inflated perception of how much you've taken away from your reading. And that reason is that we're really not very good at taking into account the differences that exist under conditions of learning and conditions of testing. Now, when you think about it, when you're learning, you have both the questions and the answers available to you. But when you're being tested, or when you have occasion to recall something, generally speaking, then you're only left with the questions. Now, you think that people's studying practices would take this into account, but unfortunately that's often not the case. The failure to take into account the differences that exist between conditions of learning and conditions of recall was really nicely demonstrated in a study by Koriat and Bjork in 2005. To illustrate what happened in this study, I'm going to ask you to consider a pair of words. The first word in this word pair is the word fire. The second word in this word pair is the word blaze. Now, imagine that was a word pair that you had to remember during the process of taking part in an experiment. I've got a simple question for you. Let's say that one of these words served as a cue or a prompt word, and the other word served as the target word, i.e. the word you had to remember. Do you think it would matter in terms of the likelihood you'd be able to recall the target word, which of these two words served as the target and which served as the prompt? I wouldn't be surprised if you said, well, no, I don't think it matters which of those two words serves as the prompt word and which one serves as the target. They're both fairly short and commonly used words and probably equally likely to be able to remember either of them. But you'd be wrong, and here's why. If you consider the word fire and you're thinking about using that as a prompt word, well, what kind of words come to mind when you hear the word fire? Probably, fire escape, fire axe, firefighter, those kind of things. But I'm guessing the word blaze would be fairly low down on that list, if it was even on the list at all. This is what we call a backwards pairing. And what that means is that the prompt word is very unlikely to elicit the target word. Now let's turn that on its head for a second and assume that the word blaze is now the prompt word. What kind of words come to mind when you think of the word blaze? Well, in this instance, the only word that really comes to mind is the word fire. In fact, I can't think of any other words that I would associate readily with the word blaze. Now, this is what we would call a forwards pairing. In other words, the prompt word is highly likely to generate the target word. Now, you've probably sussed out, having heard that these two conditions are not equivalent in terms of the ease with which the target word is likely to be recalled. And you hope that when you give participants a list of words that are manipulated so that some of them are forwards paired, so the prompt word is very likely to elicit the target word, and some of them are backwards paired, so it's actually very difficult for the prompt word to elicit the target word. You'd hope people would know that and realise it, and then if you ask them to estimate the likelihood that they would be able to pair up those words successfully, they would give lower estimates of the likelihood of them being able to pair the words for the words that were backwards paired. But research such as that by Koriat and Bjork suggests that's not the case. And often people will give equivalent estimates of the likelihood they will recall successfully forwards and backwards pairings, but of course they'll be much more successful in recalling the forwards pairing words. Now at this point you might be thinking, why on earth did those participants not realise that it was going to be much more difficult to remember the backwards pairing words than the forwards pairing words? And the answer is really simple, because when they were learning those word pairings, they had both the prompt word and the target word available to them. And this availability of information was masking the fact that when it came to the point of them recalling the words, only the prompt word would be available. And because they didn't test themselves under those conditions, they weren't aware that the forwards pairing words were going to be much easier to remember than the backwards pairing words. And a very, very similar thing happens when you're studying with your books open all of the time. You're reading your material merrily away and thinking this is starting to feel familiar to me now. But the problem is, when it comes to the point of recall or the point where you are tested on that material, that information is not going to be available to you. And of course, then it suddenly becomes an entirely new and much more difficult ballgame. So the take-home message for you in terms of the one important thing you can do for your studying practices to avoid falling foul of the illusion of knowledge is to always ensure that you don't spend the entire time that you've devoted to studying just reading with your books open. You need to periodically close your books and attempt to recall the information under conditions that are going to exist in the examination, or conditions that are going to exist when you have occasion to try and remember that information in the future. Now I'm going to do a separate video on the process of self-testing, or retrieval practice as we call it in psychology. But for now, just remember the take-home message that it's very easy when you're reading material to get an illusory impression of how much of that material you can actually remember. And the only defence you really have against this is to close your source materials and actually have a go at recalling that information under test conditions. If you do that, you'll get a much more accurate idea of how much material you can actually recall from your sources.